don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
Okay, so quick disclaimer out of the way. I really like the channel Robin Swords. As a humor practitioner myself, I find his content to be very interesting and informative, and for the purposes of this video, thought-provoking. I've also linked to his channel in the description so you can see more of the stuff that he makes. This video is a response video of sorts to his video, well, short really, about how fantasy underutilizes ships. The purpose of this video is to dissect that thought and to offer some reasons for why this might be the case. After all, the first step to solving a problem is understanding why it exists in the first place. If you like this video and want to see more like it, why not consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like? Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. So, to start with, let's outline the problem as given by Robin Swords.
I think ships are underutilized in fantasy. Not underrepresented, but consistently limited to pirate stories and plot devices. There's something sci-fi delivers on with greater consistency, giving us no shortage of ships that aren't just home to the characters, but part of the family. The Serenity, the Normandy, the Falcon, the Rocinante, the Enterprise, the Orville. But how many fantasy ships come to your mind that aren't crewed by pirates? Oh, but those can fly, you might think. The ocean is more constraining, but is it really? Literally, sure. But narratively, how often do sci-fi settings actually treat the worlds they visit as worlds and not just varied ports of call? You don't need to landlock your story to get varied environments. Expand your scope beyond the tropics, and the world is your oyster. Every kind of environment you could want can be reached by water. Don't forget about rivers. Your characters don't need to inhabit some great big old man of war. Put them in something smaller, cozier, more manageable that can sail up rivers for inland adventures. Shoot, you could even have them camp on the riverbank. Give your characters a waterborne home that they can come to love as part of the family, and your audience will do the same.
So then, I totally agree. Sci-fi is full of ships that are not only merely set dressing, they're actually part of the cast almost, that they have personalities that emerge over the course of the story and distinctive visual looks. They contribute something to it. I'm a big fan of Battlestar Galactica, and the ship itself is a core reason for why. Many of the ships of sci-fi have gone on to become very iconic in their own right. We all recognize the silhouette of an X-Wing after all. But this has not happened in fantasy. While I certainly think that there is potential for this to occur, I also think that there are some real challenges that are inherent to fantasy stories that sci-fi stories have an easier time overcoming. I have a list here of what I think are the most pertinent challenges, and if you'll allow me, I'll go through them. So, starting off, one reason that I think ships in sci-fi are really more prevalent is that they are actually closer to movable homes. If you think about it, a ship in a sci-fi setting can normally provide for all of the needs of the crew in a much more meaningful sense than any ocean-going ship. Space is normally dangerous and vast, so the ship has to be able to be a lot more self-contained than any ocean-going ship. Think about the replicators from Star Trek, or the Ishimura from Dead Space. In sci-fi, ships can have everything from basic fabrication tools all the way up to mobile factories for producing more of themselves. The idea of a ship being able to support the life and comfort of its crew is much easier to accept in sci-fi, well, because they have all sorts of technologies that make it so. Anyone with even a passing familiarity of naval history will be able to tell you that the conditions on ships until fairly recently were not all that great at all. In fact, many of them were very terrible. So it stands to reason that a fantasy setting doesn't have the kinds of amenities that we would expect of a futuristic ship, or even perhaps a modern one. And this would not be a place that people would want to stay on for longer than they need to. If your basic sailing ship is really just capable of getting you from point A to point B, you're not going to linger on it in the way you might, for example, linger on something like the Millennium Falcon. It makes the ships less of a home and more of a device to get from place to place, which historically they were for a very long time. Fantasy and history are really tied together, so I think you'd have to do a lot of work for a ship made of wood and sail to seem as comfortable as one with a holodeck and food replicators. One solution to this problem might simply be to provide a magical or fantasy equivalent for any kind of sci-fi capacity that a sci-fi ship might have. But I don't like this answer, as I feel it doesn't really lend itself to what fantasy does well, and it's just kind of a very cheap cop-out by just copying sci-fi and then translating it into fantasy. It's something that you can do, of course, but I don't necessarily think it's very optimal. The second problem is the sense of scale, which is also kind of related to our first problem, if you think about it. Space is huge, bigger than any ocean could ever be, by virtue of the fact that space is theoretically infinite, whereas an ocean can only be as large as the planet it's on. I think this works against fantasy again in a couple of ways. Sci-fi has means of adjusting the distances that can be traveled by ships depending on the stories being told. In settings where hyperspace or warp jumps are very prevalent, well, sci-fi stories can actually be quite fast-paced and intensive, because a ship is always just one warp jump away from wherever it needs to be. How much tension has Star Trek wrung out of a malfunctioning warp drive, for example? The opposite is also true. Sci-fi stories can easily be about the difficulties of space travel and how vast and empty space often is. Whole generations might grow up on a vast generational ship, hurtling through space on the hope that they might find a habitable planet to live on. It defies belief, however, that a wooden ship could do the same, especially at the same scale, and of course, especially if the ship didn't have sails, for example. But coming back to the question of scale, how large are the oceans of your fantasy setting? What would be the point of having continuous voyages that need to last years or months? There are plenty of nautical stories that involve great voyages, yes. The Odyssey famously comes to mind, but even in what is ostensibly a story about a man just trying to get home, it's interspersed with frequent sojourns on land because, well, no ship could sail for that long back in those days. The ship itself is not really a central feature of the story. Most people barely even remember it as just a vehicle to get Odysseus from one place to the next. In reality, most naval voyages in the context of fantasy stories are just a means to get the character from one interesting place to the next. There can be drama about problems along the way, but that isn't often the focus of the story. Fantasy stories, by their nature, are rarely about technology with a capital T. In a sci-fi story, someone can sit down and give you the techno-babble explanation for how to fix the ship. It might not be the best thing for the story, but it wouldn't necessarily seem amiss. Stopping your fantasy epic for someone to give an explanation of the carpentry required to repair their ship probably wouldn't go down very well, which of course leads me to my next point. Robin Swords brings up a good point about the Age of Sail. All this time I've been talking about fantasy, I've meant it more in a Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings sense, but there is a genre that features ships quite heavily that isn't necessarily sci-fi, and that's the Age of Sail, or sometimes just sort of colloquially referred to as the pirate genre. But there is a catch. It's not sci-fi, but it's not necessarily fantasy either. The Age of Sail happened hundreds of years after the medieval era. It's a different kind of story with different conventions, levels of technology, social development, and so on and so forth. A traditional fantasy story, or even most fantasy stories, differ significantly from Age of Sail stories by virtue of the fact that they are different settings. I don't have anything wrong with Age of Sail stories. In fact, one of my favorite is Master and Commander. But there is a problem with their proliferation, especially into the fantasy genre itself. Our own naval history is almost as old as human civilization, and yet for the most part, whenever a fantasy, or at least non-sci-fi, setting involves ships, it will invariably draw upon the Age of Sail for its basis, even if that makes no sense for the actual story. Like, how many medieval stories have ships that fight or act like ships of the line from the Napoleonic era? Or worse yet, have cannons and fight in lines of battle? And the reason for this, I think, is that both authors and the general public know very little about the rest of naval history. Think about it. How much naval history do you really know outside of the basic stuff about the Age of Sail and maybe a couple of things about World War II? I'd say that the average person reading or writing fantasy has very little background context for naval history in the classical era, for example, or even the actual medieval era. This, for me, is one of the biggest factors behind why ships don't get that much more prevalence in fantasy stories. Fantasy writers basically are only drawing upon a single pool for their understanding and context of naval history, but there's a much wider world that they've largely ignored. You might think that earlier periods of naval history have many problems that I've talked about previously, but I also believe that these periods of history bring unique elements to their storytelling. For example, yes, a trireme-type galley is probably never going to be a long-distance ship. Historically, they were never used outside of the Mediterranean except in very specific, rare exceptions. In real life, these things were basically only built for the Mediterranean Sea, and if you want to get across the Mediterranean, like for example the Atlantic, you need something much sturdier and generally something using sails. But because they were so labor-intensive and had to typically be beached overnight, there are plenty of opportunities for making the audience actually care about the ship. If the ship has a very vulnerable period, i.e. nighttime, you can really get the audience invested in protecting it, while it's beached on a beach somewhere. There are defined roles on board a trireme for its officers, its crew, its sailors, its rowers, and they all have to function together in order for the ship to work. There's an inherent opportunity here for telling a very compelling, close-knit story about the crew of a trireme who are doing military operations in a fantasy setting. Galley warfare, I argue, is well suited for fantasy stories where the deeds of individual heroes can change the tide of battle, and where melee is going to be a lot more prevalent and decisive than things like guns or cannons. There is a lot that could be done with this. Writers just need to be willing to be creative and explore outside of the norms that we've been trapped in for so long. My final point relates to what the different genres might do differently and therefore bring to the table regarding settings, composition of those settings, and so on. Yes, as a fan of naval warfare and history, I think that ships are underutilized in fantasy. I am kind of toying with the idea of making a video about Game of Thrones and where it fails in its naval history specifically, but again, I digress. However, I also think that there are other things that occupy the ship niche in fantasy that might be traditionally occupied by spaceships in sci-fi. I'm talking about fantastical mounts or beasts. I know it seems strange to think about it to compare a ship to a dragon, but think about it. Some of the most popular fantasy stories like Aragon, what is the center of the story? It's the dragon. The dragon takes the place of a spaceship, doesn't it? Fantasy is actually unique in this regard as compared to sci-fi, where stories about dragons and other fantastical creatures, I would argue, occupy the same niche that a spaceship does. In a story with a dragon rider, the dragon becomes its own character. It's part of the story. It's iconic. It can be hurt, requiring the intervention and help of the rider. The dragon takes the rider where they need to go, exploring the world from a perspective that's uncommon in the world itself, of course, depending on how ubiquitous dragons actually are, and of course, becoming an iconic part of the story. It's basically a ship, but instead of asking Scotty to give it all she's got, you rely on the power of friendship with the dragon to see her troubles through. Lasers and missiles are replaced by dragonfire and claws. In a setting like A Song of Ice and Fire, dragons are basically battleships, as compared to the regular sailing navy, which is medieval in its origin. Although, again, wait for that video, that's not necessarily true. One of the notable exceptions I think that you could probably make is something like steampunk. Steampunk settings give you enough technobabble plausibility to have elements from sci-fi that could be incorporated into your shipbuilding. Like, for example, you could have a steampunk device that produces food or energy. At the same time, you can still blend more fantasy elements into the setting as well, because it's steampunk. The technology is not necessarily meant to be super good or super effective or super prevalent, but it's still there. After all, stories are often about heroes, and heroes are exceptional in various different ways. But of course, I don't really think this solves the problem that we started with. I think we've merely just kicked it down the road that is lit by gas lamps now instead of torches. But you get my meaning. I think one solution to our ship problem is to simply adopt the conventions that are established in sci-fi and then try to port them into a fantasy context. A sci-fi ship AI becomes an elemental djinn, for example. I don't like this solution because it's basically just a form of imitation. I would prefer that we try to use the strengths of fantasy to tell fantasy stories. I think it would require a lot of careful thought, but hey, that's what writers are for.